My mother slammed the heavy gold-embossed fountain pen onto the mahogany library desk and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You will sign this debt assumption agreement, Clara, and you will do it right now," she commanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperate panic and practiced authority. "Your brother Julian made a minor miscalculation with his real estate investment, and if you don't absorb this $1 million liability, his entire future will be ruined." Right beside her stood my 28-year-old brother Julian, wearing a tailored Italian suit paid for by my father's empty credit cards, looking down at his manicured nails with an arrogant smirk. They thought they had trapped me in the library of the sprawling 6-bedroom colonial mansion in Buckhead, Georgia, an estate worth $4.5 million. They believed I was merely a subtenant living in the estate's guest cottage out of their sheer charity. They had no idea that through an anonymous Delaware LLC named Aegis Holdings, I had quietly purchased this entire estate from the bank 3 years ago to save them from a humiliating foreclosure. So I leaned back in the leather armchair, looked at my watch, and calmly told them they had exactly 48 hours to pack up their belongings and get out of my house. Before I tell you how a lifetime of playing the family scapegoat turned into a cold, legal eviction that they never saw coming, hit like and let me know where you are listening from, because I know there are many of you who have been treated like an ATM by the very people who claimed to raise you. For 32 years, my family had operated under a strict, unspoken hierarchy. Julian was the brilliant, handsome golden child who could do no wrong, despite failing out of 3 colleges and bankrupting 2 of my father's small businesses with his reckless, speculative ventures. I was the quiet, nerdy daughter who worked 80-hour weeks as a corporate forensic accountant, building a private real estate portfolio while living frugally in the shadow of their loud, fake wealthy lifestyle. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Vance, had spent the last decade burning through their retirement funds and taking out predatory loans to fund Julian's luxury apartment rentals, his country club memberships, and his designer wardrobe. Whenever the bills came due, they would corner me, using tears, guilt, and screams of family loyalty to force me to transfer thousands of dollars to cover Julian's bounced checks. But this time, they had crossed a line that no amount of emotional manipulation could ever erase. The library of the mansion felt suffocating, filled with the heavy scent of my father's expensive cigars and the clinking of my mother's silver charm bracelets. My father, Robert, paced near the high-arched windows, his face red and his breathing heavy as he looked at me like I was a rebellious employee. "Don't look at us with that blank face, Clara," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at the document resting on the desk. "Julian's creditors are threatening a formal lawsuit, and if the Buckhead community finds out about this, our family's reputation will be utterly destroyed." Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension as he adjusted his luxury watch. "Look, Vicky, it's just $1 million. With your fancy corporate salary and those little properties you boast about, you can easily secure a commercial loan to wipe this clean. Besides, we let you live in the guest house for practically nothing, so it's time you finally paid your fair share." I looked at the document they had drafted through their corrupt family attorney. It was a binding contract, transferring the entirety of Julian's defaulted commercial real estate debt directly to my personal accounts, leaving him completely legally insulated while ruining my financial standing. My mother leaned over the desk, her eyes narrowed as she tried to use the same icy glare that had kept me submissive throughout my entire childhood. "If you do not sign this by tomorrow morning, Clara, We are terminating your lease on the guest cottage, throwing your belongings into the street, and formally cutting you off from this family." She believed she was holding the ultimate leverage, thinking that the fear of being homeless and abandoned would make me sign my financial death warrant. She truly believed that they were the masters of this beautiful estate, completely unaware that the monthly rent they paid to an offshore property management company was actually being deposited directly into my corporate operating account. I did not scream. I did not cry. And I did not waste my breath pointing out the sheer madness of their demands. I simply stood up, folded my arms, and looked at my mother, then my father, and finally my smug brother, who was already smiling as if he had won the battle. "I will not sign a single page of this document, and I will not pay a single dime of Julian's debt," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and dangerously calm. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck, while my father took a step toward me, his fists clenching in rage. "You ungrateful little brat!" he roared. "We gave you life. We gave you a place to live. And this is how you repay us? You have until Friday to pack your bags and get off our land." I let him finish his tirade, letting him dig the hole so deep that no lawyer in Georgia would ever be able to pull him out of it. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the state corporate registry app, and held the screen directly in front of my father's face, showing him the active, certified ownership deed of the Buckhead Mansion. "This land does not belong to you, Dad," I said softly, watching the color instantly drain from his face as his eyes scanned the legal description and the name of the managing member of Aegis Holdings, LLC, Clara Vance. "I bought this house at the foreclosure auction 3 years ago, and the lease you signed with the management company allows for immediate termination in the event of illegal activity or non-compliance. You have 48 hours to pack your bags, pack Julian's expensive suits, and vacate my property, or the county sheriff will assist you in leaving." The silence that fell over the mahogany library was absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Julian's smirk vanished, his eyes darting frantically between my father and the glowing phone screen in my hand, while my mother sank slowly into the leather desk chair, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a worthless utility, a quiet cash register they could punch whenever their fake wealth collapsed under the weight of their greed. But as I turned and walked out of the library, leaving them standing in the shadow of their own ruin, I knew they would not go quietly. They still believed they could fight me, still believed that family guilt and social pressure could force me to back down. But they had no idea that I was already 5 steps ahead of them. The gravel path leading from the main house to my guest cottage was dark, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the mansion's landscape lighting. I walked slowly, listening to the rain-soaked Georgia pines swaying in the cold wind, feeling the weight of 30 years of family expectations finally lifting off my shoulders. The guest cottage was a modest 2-bedroom stone structure that had originally been built for estate staff in the 1940s, but my parents had relegated me to it the moment I finished my master's degree, claiming it was good practice for me to pay them rent while Julian occupied the entire 3rd-floor master suite in the main house. Inside, the cottage was clean, quiet, and filled with my own books and simple furniture, a stark contrast to the mansion's gaudy, gilded interiors, which were stuffed with expensive European antiques purchased on maxed-out credit cards. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat at my small wooden dining table, and pulled out my laptop to check the Aegis Holdings secure database. The clock was already ticking on the 48-hour notice, and I knew that once the initial shock wore off, my parents' panic would quickly mutate into a desperate, toxic rage. To understand why my parents felt so entitled to my life's work, you have to understand the toxic hierarchy they had built around my brother, Julian. From the day he was born, Julian was treated as the savior of the Vance family name, a golden child whose charm was supposed to elevate us into the highest echelons of Atlanta high society. When he was 24, my father convinced a local bank to lend him $300,000 for a luxury car rental startup, a business that went bankrupt in less than 10 months because Julian spent the company's operating capital on VIP tables at nightclubs and weekend trips to Miami. When the bank threatened to sue, my parents did not punish him. Instead, they sat me down in this very cottage and wept, claiming that if I didn't co-sign a consolidation loan using my newly established credit, our family would be publicly disgraced. I was 26 then, young, desperate for their approval, and still foolish enough to believe that if I saved them, they would finally love me. I signed the paperwork, spent the next 4 years paying off his $300,000 debt while working 80-hour weeks, and in return, Julian didn't offer a single word of thanks. He simply asked my father for $50,000 to start a luxury clothing line. My family's wealth was a beautiful, hollow shell, a paper-thin illusion constructed from leased luxury SUVs, unpaid country club dues, and a mountain of revolving credit. My father, Robert Vance, had once owned a successful regional logistics firm, but he had spent the last decade liquidating its assets to fund my mother's obsession with looking wealthy in front of her charity committee friends. They lived in a constant cycle of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, taking out high-interest merchant cash advances and pretending to be Buckhead royalty while their utility bills were quietly sent to my address because their own accounts were constantly overdrawn. 3 years ago, when the bank finally initiated foreclosure proceedings on the mansion, they didn't tell their friends. They secretly begged me to find a way to save them. I agreed, but on one strict condition. I would purchase the home through my real estate holding company, Aegis Holdings, and they would pay a monthly occupancy fee that covered the taxes and maintenance. They agreed in writing, but the moment the papers were signed, they convinced themselves that the arrangement was just a technicality and that the mansion was still their personal kingdom. My thoughts were interrupted by the furious sound of high heels clicking sharply against the wet stone path outside. The cottage door flew open without a knock, and my mother burst into my small living room, her face flushed red with anger and her designer trench coat dripping water onto my hardwood floor. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the low ceilings as she pointed a manicured hand at me. "How dare you play these childish games with your father and me? We raised you, Clara. We gave you everything. And now you're fabricating fake company records to pretend you own our home?" My father walked in right behind her, his chest heaving as he closed the door with a violent slam that rattled the windows. "I don't know what kind of financial trickery you're pulling with your accounting job, Clara," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "But you are going to call your lawyer right now and dissolve this ridiculous Aegis company. You do not own this estate, and you will not humiliate your brother." I sat perfectly still, my teacup resting in my hands, letting the warmth of the porcelain keep me grounded as I watched them unravel in front of me. "There is no trickery, Dad," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the shaking fear they were so used to hearing from me during my childhood. "Aegis Holdings purchased the deed 3 years ago for $2.8 million. You signed the occupancy agreement as tenants, and you haven't paid the monthly maintenance fee in 7 months, which is a material breach of the contract. Furthermore, you have actively harbored Julian, who is using this property to evade creditors for a $1 million debt that he acquired through fraudulent business filings." My mother let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, tossing her wet hair back as she looked around my simple cottage with disgust. "You think you're so smart with your numbers, don't you? You think a piece of paper makes you the boss of this family. We will tell everyone at the Oak Ridge Country Club what you are doing. We will tell your employers that you are stealing from your own parents." My father stepped closer to the table, his shadow looming over me as he tried to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission, just as he had done whenever I questioned his financial decisions in the past. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little bitch," he whispered, his eyes dark with malice. "If you don't sign that debt assumption agreement for Julian by tomorrow morning, I will personally file a lawsuit against you for elder abuse and financial fraud. I have friends on the county commission and the local bank boards, and I will make sure your career as a forensic accountant is completely dead before the week is over." He believed his empty threats still carried the weight of the prestige he had lost years ago, completely unaware that his influential friends had already blocked his phone number because of his unpaid debts. I let them talk, keeping my eyes fixed on my father's face, watching the desperation flicker behind his angry eyes. Every threatening word they spoke was being recorded by the security camera I had installed in the corner of my living room, adding another layer of ironclad evidence to the file I was building. "You have 47 hours left," I said quietly, looking down at my laptop screen. "The legal notice has already been filed with the county clerk. If you attempt to vandalize the main house, lock me out of the gates, or launch a smear campaign against my professional license, my attorney will immediately file for an emergency restraining order and speed up the physical eviction process. I suggest you spend your remaining time finding a moving truck and a cheap apartment that Julian can actually afford." My mother looked at my father, a sudden flash of real terror finally piercing through her arrogant mask as she realized that her quiet, obedient daughter was no longer there to be controlled. My father opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped him mid-breath. He realized, for the first time in his life, that he had absolutely no power over me. They turned and stormed out of the cottage, slamming the door so hard that a small ceramic vase on my shelf slid off and shattered on the floor. I stood up, swept up the broken pieces, and sat back down at my computer, ready to call my attorney to prepare the next phase of our plan. "Tell me honestly, would you have served your own parents with an eviction notice after they threatened to ruin your entire career? If you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who mistook your silence for weakness, you will understand why I had to protect my peace." The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when I sat at my cottage desk, watching the thick, gray Georgia fog cling to the manicured lawns of the estate. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the heavy, damp scent of wet asphalt and pine needles, but the atmosphere remained thick with an undeniable, electric tension. I had already poured my first cup of black coffee and was on the phone with Charles Thornton, a senior partner at one of Atlanta's most prestigious real estate law firms, whom I had retained under Aegis Holdings. Charles was a methodical, no-nonsense attorney who had handled the foreclosure purchase of the mansion 3 years ago, and he was currently reviewing the final eviction petition we had prepared. "The paperwork is filed, Clara," Charles confirmed, his voice crisp and clear over the speakerphone. "And the process server is scheduled to arrive at the main house by 8:15 sharp. Your parents have no legal ground to contest this, especially given their 7 months of unpaid occupancy fees. But be prepared for them to try and stall the process." Before the process server arrived, I had my own financial defense to fortify, a task that my years as a forensic accountant had prepared me for with absolute precision. I logged into my secured treasury management portal, locking down every single business account, commercial line of credit, and investment trust associated with Aegis Holdings. I then began a meticulous review of my personal credit files, a routine safety measure that suddenly revealed a terrifying anomaly. Tucked deep within a dormant savings account my father had opened for me when I was 18, an account I had long since emptied but kept open to preserve my credit age, was a pending electronic transfer authorization for $50,000. The routing number belonged to a private bank in downtown Atlanta, and the authorization had been initiated just 12 hours ago using my father's old secondary access credentials. I immediately canceled the transfer, flagged the transaction as unauthorized, and completely severed his name from the account, realizing with a cold chill that my family was already trying to drain my assets to cover Julian's impending disaster. At precisely 8:15, a black sedan pulled up the long, winding brick driveway of the estate, its headlights cutting through the lingering morning fog. A tall, imposing man in a dark suit stepped out of the vehicle, carrying a thick manila envelope stamped with the seal of the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. I watched from behind the sheer curtains of my cottage window as my father, clad in a silk monogrammed bathrobe and clutching a silver cup of espresso, opened the heavy mahogany double doors of the mansion. The process server did not waste time with pleasantries. He confirmed my father's identity, handed him the envelope, and calmly stated, "Robert Vance, you have been formally served with an emergency eviction petition and a 48-hour notice to vacate these premises." My father stood frozen on the grand stone portico, his espresso cup trembling as the server turned, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving him staring at the bright red legal notice attached to the front of the documents. Less than 10 minutes later, the peace of my cottage was shattered as Julian came charging down the stone path, his face twisted into a mask of pure, hysterical panic. He didn't even bother to open the door this time. He stood outside my kitchen window, banging violently on the double-paned glass while waving the crumpled eviction papers in the air. "Are you completely insane, Clara?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation as I opened the window a few inches to look at him. "This eviction petition is going to show up on public court registries, and if Vanguard Shipping sees that our family home is in foreclosure and litigation, they will pull out of our $39 million acquisition deal. You are destroying everything I have spent years building." I leaned against the windowsill, looking down at his disheveled hair and the expensive silk pajama pants he was wearing, feeling absolutely no pity for his panic. "I am not destroying your deal, Julian," I said, my voice as cold and calm as the morning air. "You destroyed yourself the moment you tried to force me to take on $1 million debt that you ran up through your own greed and incompetence." Julian slammed his fist against the exterior stone wall, his breathing ragged as he tried to regain his footing. "You don't understand, Clara. The bank has already approved the security line based on your backing. They have the signature guarantees. If you pull out now, the bank will file criminal fraud charges against the entire family." His words hung in the damp morning air, and a sudden, sharp realization cut through my mind like a scalpel. I slowly opened the window all the way, leaning forward as I kept my eyes locked onto his shifting, guilty gaze. "Show me the proof, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper that made him freeze. "Show me the signed guarantee where I legally agreed to back your loan. Show me one single document containing my physical signature or my digital authorization." Julian stammered, his face turning an ash-gray color as he took a step back from the window. My attorney handled the digital signing," he mumbled, his voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant volume. "It was all done through the joint family portal. It was a standard authorization." In that single, desperate sentence, Julian had just confirmed my worst suspicion. He had not just made a bad investment. He had actively forged my signature on federal loan documents to secure $1 million credit line. I did not let him see the shock on my face, nor did I let him know that he had just handed me the very weapon I needed to dismantle his entire empire. "You have 46 hours left," I said, my finger slowly wrapping around the window latch. "I suggest you spend them talking to a criminal defense attorney, because the moment the sheriff arrives to escort you off my property, I will be requesting a full forensic audit of every loan document associated with my name." I shut the window firmly, locked it, and pulled the blinds closed, leaving Julian standing alone in the cold fog, clutching a stack of papers that had just become the blueprint for his own destruction. "Would you have stayed silent after discovering that your own brother forged your signature on $1 million loan? Or would you have called the authorities right then and there if you caught the first major clue to their fraudulent scheme before they did? Tell me in the comments below. Because this is the moment the hunter officially became the prey. By 10 o'clock that morning, my phone had turned into a relentless, vibrating weapon, buzzing against the wooden surface of my desk every 30 seconds. The smear campaign had officially begun, exactly as I had predicted, starting with a flood of furious text messages and voicemails from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years. My Aunt Beatrice sent a 3-paragraph message calling me a heartless monster who was throwing her own flesh and blood into the street, while my cousin Marcus left a voicemail accusing me of exploiting my parents' temporary financial struggles for my own personal greed. I did not reply to a single message, nor did I delete them. Instead, I quietly took screenshots, compiled the audio files, and saved them directly into an encrypted folder labeled Harassment and Defamation Evidence. I knew that in the tight-knit, status-obsessed community of Buckhead, my mother's primary weapon would always be public shame, and she was currently preparing to unleash its full, unchecked fury against me. Eleanor Vance's social media assault was launched with calculated, theatrical precision shortly before noon. A colleague from my firm sent me a link to a public video my mother had posted on Facebook, filmed in the grand, light-filled living room of the mansion with the family portrait prominently displayed in the background. In the video, her eyes were red and her voice trembled with practiced grief as she spoke directly to the camera about the unspeakable betrayal of a daughter who had secretly stolen their home during a family crisis. She wept openly, claiming that they were being evicted by their own child and forced onto the streets with nowhere to go, begging her community for prayers and support. Within hours, the video had accumulated hundreds of shares, and the comments were filled with outraged Buckhead socialites calling for my public exposure, demanding that my employers be notified of my predatory behavior. The professional strike came at exactly 11:30 when the caller ID on my phone displayed the name of Arthur Henderson, the senior managing partner at Henderson and Associates, the elite forensic accounting firm where I worked. I took a deep breath, composed my face into a mask of absolute professional calm, and answered the call. Clara, I'm calling because our HR director just received a highly disturbing, emotional phone call from a woman claiming to be your mother, Arthur said, his tone heavy with concern and corporate discomfort. She alleged that you used our firm's proprietary database search tools to target her assets, commit elder fraud, and illegally seize her primary residence. As you know, Clara, our firm handles high-profile federal clients, and even the hint of such unethical behavior is a massive liability. I did not panic, nor did I offer a rambling, emotional defense. I simply opened my email client and prepared a pre-formatted message I had drafted weeks in advance for this exact scenario. Arthur, I completely understand your concern, and I appreciate you bringing this directly to me, I replied, my voice cool, measured, and entirely professional. I have just sent you a secure PDF containing the certified property deed of the Buckhead Mansion from 3 years ago, which shows Aegis Holdings LLC purchased the property at a public foreclosure auction. I have also attached the bank foreclosure records, the unpaid occupancy invoices showing my parents owe over $40,000 in back fees, and the formal eviction petition filed by my attorney. As you will see, this is a standard landlord-tenant dispute involving family members who have defaulted on their agreements, and no proprietary firm resources were ever used. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line as Arthur reviewed the ironclad documentation I had just dropped into his inbox. I could hear the faint sound of his mouse clicking as he opened the files, followed by a long, relieved sigh. My God, Clara. They didn't pay a single dime of their occupancy fees for 7 months, he muttered, his voice shifting from corporate suspicion to genuine embarrassment. This deed is completely clean. I am incredibly sorry you are going through this, and I will have HR flag any further calls from your family as malicious harassment. Just please ensure this personal matter remains entirely separate from your casework. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and smiled, knowing that my mother's attempt to get me fired had succeeded only in proving my absolute legal and financial competence to the head of my firm. While my mother was attacking my career, Julian was attempting a much cruder form of financial starvation by trying to cut off my access to the guest cottage. A representative from the local utility company called me shortly after lunch, sounding deeply confused as she explained that a young man claiming to be the owner of the estate had requested the immediate disconnection of the power and water services to the guest house. I calmly provided her with the master account number for Aegis Holdings, which controlled all utility contracts for the entire 5-acre property, and verified my security passcode. The representative apologized profusely, noting that Julian's attempt to terminate the services was highly irregular and would be flagged on their system as an unauthorized tampering attempt. By mid-afternoon, my father tried a more direct, aggressive approach, calling me from a blocked number that I made the conscious decision to answer. "You think you've won, don't you, Clara?" he shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. The background noise filled with the sound of my mother frantically sobbing. "We are not leaving this house. We have hired an aggressive litigation attorney who is going to file an emergency injunction to halt this ridiculous eviction. and we will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. You will be bankrupt from legal fees before you ever see us pack a single box." I let him scream, listening to his desperate threats without interrupting, counting every contradiction and every empty promise as he spoke. "I let you talk, Dad, because every word you say confirms that you have absolutely no legal defense," I said quietly, my voice cutting through his shouting like a steel blade. "An injunction requires a showing of a likelihood of success on the merits, and you don't even have a signed lease, let alone a deed. You have 38 hours left, and every phone call you make to my employers, my utility companies, or my bank is simply adding another count of civil harassment to the lawsuit my attorney is preparing to file against you." I hung up before he could reply, knowing that their rage was nothing more than the thrashing of cornered animals who had finally realized their golden cage was about to be locked from the outside. Would you have stayed as calm as I did while your own mother tried to get you fired from your dream job? Or would you have marched up to the main house and confronted her face to face? If your family has ever launched a vicious smear campaign against you just because you finally decided to stand up for yourself, you will understand why I had to let the law do the talking. For years, my family had comforted themselves with the belief that I was nothing more than an ordinary, overworked desk clerk at a mid-tier accounting firm. A quiet girl who survived on a modest, entry-level salary. They needed to believe this because it justified their contempt. It allowed my mother to feel superior and allowed Julian to act as the family's true intellectual giant. In reality, 6 years ago, I had spent my nights and weekends developing a revolutionary, proprietary algorithmic auditing engine called Aegis 6, a software that automatically identifies complex asset hiding schemes, shell company transfers, and tax fraud. I had licensed this platform to 3 of the largest private wealth management banks in the United States through an anonymous blind trust, generating millions of dollars in passive royalty payments that flowed directly into a secured asset protection trust. I had kept this massive financial success completely hidden from my family, knowing with absolute certainty that if they ever discovered the true extent of my wealth, they would have stopped at nothing to bleed me dry in the name of family duty. The Buckhead Mansion itself was not just a house. It was a highly structured asset held within a complex web of legal protection. When the property fell into foreclosure 3 years ago, I didn't purchase it directly. I used a subsidiary of my private trust, Aegis Holdings, LLC, to acquire the deed, deliberately keeping my name off any public-facing real estate databases. My parents and Julian believed they were dealing with a faceless, corporate landlord represented by a distant property management group, which is why they felt so comfortable ignoring their occupancy fees and treating the estate as their personal playground. To them, the landlord was just an abstract entity they could ignore and manipulate, completely unaware that every single excuse they emailed to the management company was being forwarded directly to my personal inbox. I had allowed them to live in this delusion because I wanted to provide them with a roof over their heads without exposing my true identity. But their greed had finally forced me to pull back the curtain. Now, as the clock ticked down on their 48-hour eviction notice, I sat at my laptop and opened the secure portal containing the digital file on Julian's default notice from Vanguard Private Wealth. Julian's supposedly brilliant business venture was a shell company named Vance Logistics Group, which he had registered using our family's name to create the illusion of a multi-generational shipping empire. To secure the $1 million commercial credit line from Vanguard, Julian had submitted a commercial loan agreement using the Buckhead mansion as collateral. He had presented the bank with a notarized power of attorney signed by my father, Robert Vance, which supposedly authorized Julian to leverage the estate for business purposes. My father had willingly signed the document, desperate to fund his golden son's dreams, entirely ignoring the minor detail that he no longer held any legal title to the property he was offering as security. But the fraud did not stop with my father's empty signature. As I zoomed in on the secondary pages of the loan packet, my blood ran cold as I examined the cosigner guarantee. There, stamped with a forged digital notary seal and containing my personal Social Security number, was a document bearing a forged signature in my name, legally binding me to Julian's debt if his shell company defaulted. Julian had not just made a bad investment. He had actively stolen my identity, forged my signature, and exposed my personal credit to $1 million liability to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had assumed that when the loan defaulted, my parents would be able to bully, guilt, and scream me into signing the debt assumption agreement, which would have retroactively legalized his forgery and cleared his name before the bank's fraud department detected the crime. As a forensic accountant, I knew that Julian's plan was as sloppy as it was illegal. But his biggest mistake was his choice of lenders. Vanguard Private Wealth was not just any private bank. They were one of the primary financial institutions that licensed my Aegis 6 auditing software to verify high-risk signatures, trace asset ownership, and prevent commercial loan fraud. In fact, because of my reputation in the industry, I was the designated Chief External Compliance Consultant for Vanguard's High Net Worth Fraud Division, a role I performed under my corporate trust identity. This meant that the exact bank Julian was attempting to defraud was a major client of my company, and I had direct, personal access to the head of the very compliance department that was currently preparing to foreclose on his assets. I pulled out my secure satellite phone, dialed a direct, private number, and waited as the line encrypted. Within 2 rings, the call was answered by Sarah Jenkins, the Chief Compliance Officer at Vanguard Private Wealth, and a close professional colleague who had worked with me on several high-profile federal fraud cases. "Clara, it's wonderful to hear from you," Sarah said, her tone warm but professional. "I assume you're calling about the quarterly system integration reports?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out my cottage window at the grand white columns of the mansion, and took a slow sip of my cold tea. "Actually, Sarah, I'm calling about a high-risk commercial default in your Atlanta private wealth sector," I said, my voice dropping to a low, precise whisper. "Vance Logistics Group has defaulted on a $1 million credit line, and the collateral listed is a Buckhead estate that they do not own. Furthermore, the cosigner guarantee on that loan contains a forged signature of my name, and I have the certified deed showing my trust LLC is the sole owner of the property." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. The kind of heavy, panicked quiet that only occurs when a high-ranking bank executive realizes they have just approved a massive, fraudulent loan. I could hear the rapid clicking of Sarah's keyboard as she pulled up the loan file, followed by a sharp, horrified intake of breath. "My God, Clara. The collateral verification was bypassed because of an internal signature override," she whispered, her voice tight with professional anger. "This is a massive federal compliance breach. If what you're telling me is true, this isn't just a default. This is a coordinated, criminal bank fraud scheme." I smiled in the darkness of my cottage, knowing that the trap had just snapped shut around my family, and they had absolutely no way out. I looked at the single $500 bill still sitting on my desk, the insulting crumb my husband had tossed at me when he demanded my surrender, and realized how small their world truly was compared to the one I controlled. The mini hook had been cast, and within 24 hours, the full, crushing weight of a federal banking investigation would descend upon the mansion they were refusing to leave. Would you have kept your multi-million-dollar success a secret from a toxic family? Or would you have used your wealth to rub their faces in your success years ago? If you have ever had to hide your light just to keep the vultures from circling, you will understand why my silence was the most dangerous weapon I possessed. The second day of the eviction timeline began with a quiet, devastating shift in the balance of power. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, a dark, unmarked Ford Explorer pulled up the gravel path and parked directly in front of my guest cottage, its police radio crackling softly in the damp morning air. Two men stepped out of the vehicle. Thomas Cross, the chief financial crimes investigator for Vanguard Private Wealth, and Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator from the Fulton County Police Department's white-collar crime division. I opened the door, welcoming them into my small living room, where I had already laid out 3 neat, color-coded folders containing my passport, my corporate travel logs, my certified signature cards, and the complete title history of the Buckhead estate. The flashing of the police radio on Detective Miller's shoulder was the first physical sign of the legal storm that was about to completely dismantle my family's illusion of security. We sat at my small dining table, which was quickly covered in high-grade printed copies of Julian's commercial loan application and the supporting credit documents. Investigator Cross pulled out the cosigner guarantee page, pointing to the digital notary stamp that had supposedly authorized the release of the final $1 million credit line. According to the digital notary metadata, Clara, this document was signed and certified on March 14th of last year at 2:45 p.m., Cross explained, his eyes sharp and analytical as he looked at me. I calmly slid my passport and my corporate travel logs across the table, pointing to the customs stamps and the physical boarding passes from that exact date. On March 14th, I was on a transatlantic flight to London to conduct an emergency forensic audit for a maritime client with absolutely zero internet access, I replied, my voice steady and precise. I did not return to the United States until March 22nd, making it physically and technologically impossible for me to have executed that digital signature. As Investigator Cross compared the digital metadata with my official travel records, Detective Miller began reviewing my certified signature cards, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the stark differences between my precise, calculated handwriting and the jagged, hurried signature Julian had forged on the loan documents. But the most devastating revelation came when Cross pulled out a secondary file containing a deeper, hidden layer of Julian's financial fraud. "It appears your brother didn't stop with the $1 million commercial loan, Clara," Cross said, his tone dropping to a grim, serious whisper. "He also used your social security number and secondary security questions to reactivate that dormant childhood savings account we flagged yesterday, using it as a revolving line of credit to siphon off an additional $150,000 in cash withdrawals." The bank's paper trail showed that the stolen funds had been wired directly to a luxury watch boutique and a yacht charter company in Miami, entirely funded by my stolen identity. I felt a cold, dull ache in my chest as I looked at the cash withdrawal ledgers. But the true, heartbreaking betrayal was revealed on the final page of the loan packet. Cross turned to the witness signature page, pointing to a neat, cursive signature that I recognized all too well. My father, Robert Vance, had signed his name as the physical witness to the loan guarantee, legally certifying under penalty of perjury that I had personally signed the document in his presence. My own father, a man I had spent my entire life trying to please, had looked at a forged signature of his daughter's name, picked up a pen, and signed his own name to validate the theft, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was willing to sacrifice my freedom and my financial future to protect his golden son. Before I could speak, the furious sound of car doors slamming outside shattered the quiet of the cottage, followed by heavy, frantic footsteps coming down the stone path. Robert Vance, having spotted the police vehicle from the mansion windows, came rushing toward my cottage, accompanied by a pale, disheveled Julian, who looked as if he hadn't slept in days. My father was wearing his expensive country club blazer and a look of arrogant confidence, believing that the police had finally arrived to arrest me for my fraudulent eviction notice and restore his control over the estate. He pushed my cottage door open without knocking, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me as he shouted, "Officers, thank God you're here. This ungrateful girl is harassing us, attempting to illegally evict her own parents from their home, and siphoning our family assets." Detective Miller stood up slowly, his towering frame instantly dominating the small room as he placed a hand firmly on his duty belt, his expression completely blank. "Sir, I suggest you step back and lower your voice immediately," Miller said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute legal authority. "We are not here to discuss an eviction. We are currently conducting a joint federal banking fraud and identity theft investigation, and Mrs. Vance's has just provided irrefutable physical and digital proof of loan forgery. Your name, Robert Vance, is listed as a primary witness on a forged document that has resulted in over $1 million of fraudulent credit release." Robert's face turned an ash-gray color, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water as the arrogant confidence vanished from his eyes in an instant. Beside him, Julian took a slow, panicked step backward, his eyes darting toward the gravel path as if he were planning to run, but Detective Miller's sharp gaze snapped directly to him. "Julian Vance, do not move," Miller commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "We have traced the IP addresses used to execute the forged signatures directly to your personal laptop, and we have the bank footage of you withdrawing the stolen funds. This investigation is active, and if you attempt to leave this property, you will be detained immediately." They stood, frozen in the doorway of my simple cottage, the reality of their crimes finally crashing down around them in front of the very authority figures they had tried to weaponize against me. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a quiet, helpless victim. But they had finally realized that their quiet victim was the one holding the keys to their prison cells. Have you ever had a parent betray you so deeply that you realized they never truly cared about your future at all? If you have ever had to watch the people who raised you look you in the eye and lie to protect their own greed, you will understand why I felt absolutely no pity as the police detective turned his gaze toward my father. After my father and Julian retreated back up the stone path in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, the cottage became a war room. I locked the front door, drew the heavy linen curtains, and sat down with my real estate attorney, Charles Thornton, and Thomas Cross to organize the massive mountain of evidence we had compiled. The wooden dining table was no longer a place for tea. It had become a legal battlefield, covered in bank statements, IP logs, forged signatures, and printed patent diagrams. Charles looked at me with a grim, admiring smile as he opened his leather briefcase and pulled out 3 identical, thick blue folders. "We have them in a vice, Clara," Charles said, his voice carrying the calm confidence of a seasoned litigator who knew his opponent had already lost. "We aren't just presenting a simple landlord-tenant eviction anymore. We are presenting a comprehensive, ironclad fraud package that will dismantle your brother's entire life's work and expose your father's complicity to the federal government." The true scale of Julian's greed was revealed when Charles opened the second section of the file, which detailed the $39 million acquisition deal with Vanguard Shipping. Julian's supposedly revolutionary proprietary software, which he had branded as the Vance Logistics System, was actually built on a copied fragment of my own Aegis 6 platform. 2 years ago, when Julian was living in the main house, he had accessed my old backup hard drive in the library, copying my unfinished logistics source code and assuming it was a failed hobby because I hadn't yet launched it under my own name. He had registered the stolen code under his shell company, forged the licensing agreements, and pitched it to Vanguard Shipping as his own creation. He had believed that once the $39 million buyout hit his account, he would be untouchable. Entirely unaware that the core algorithms of the software were protected by active federal patents held under my anonymous Aegis Trust LLC. I pulled out my secure external hard drive, its high-pitched hum filling the quiet cottage as I connected it to my laptop to display the master repository of the code. Every single line of the software Julian is trying to sell contains a unique, cryptographic digital watermark embedded in the metadata, a digital signature that cannot be erased without destroying the entire system, I explained to Investigator Cross, pointing to the glowing blue lines of code on my screen. I registered this cryptographic key with the United States Patent and Trademark Office 5 years ago, long before Julian ever touched my hard drive. He didn't just steal my work. He stole a system that contains a built-in GPS tracker pointing directly back to me as the sole, rightful owner. Investigator Cross stared at the screen, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face, as he realized that Julian had essentially walked into a bank robbery with a tracker in the money bag. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously organizing our evidence into 3 separate, identical legal packets. The first packet was prepared for the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, containing the certified property deeds, the unpaid occupancy invoices, and the formal writ of possession to execute the eviction the moment the 48-hour clock expired. The second packet was compiled for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, containing the forged cosigner guarantees, the forensic signature analysis, and the IP address logs tracing the identity theft directly to Julian's laptop. The third and final packet was prepared for the Legal Compliance Board of Vanguard Shipping, containing the active patent registrations and the cryptographic proof of the stolen intellectual property, which would instantly destroy Julian's $39 million buyout from the inside out. While we were cross-referencing the final documents, my phone buzzed with a long, frantic text message from my mother. Eleanor. The arrogant, screaming demands of the previous night were entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, weeping plea for family unity and keeping the peace. She claimed that she had always loved me, that she had only wanted the best for both of her children, and she offered to sign a secret, private agreement if I would just drop the eviction and allow Julian to finalize his deal. I did not reply. I simply took a screenshot of the message, added it to our harassment folder, and looked out the window at the grand white columns of the mansion, feeling a cold, liberating detachment from the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like an obstacle to her son's success. 7. Charles Thornton stood up, stretching his arms as he looked at his watch, which showed that we had less than 18 hours left on the eviction clock. Clara, you need to be prepared for the fact that they might try to destroy the house, hide assets, or flee the state tonight before the sheriff arrives, Charles warned me, his expression serious. I gave him a calm, reassuring smile, pointing to the security monitor on my desk, which displayed live, high-definition feeds from the perimeter of the estate. I've already anticipated that, Charles. I've hired a private security team to monitor the gates and the perimeter of the mansion 24 hours a day, with strict instructions to document any attempt to remove art, jewelry, or family assets bought with my stolen funds. If they try to leave with so much as a single painting, the police will be waiting at the gates. The trap was completely set. The legal and financial coffin built around my family with absolute mathematical precision. They were currently sitting inside the grand mansion, frantic, desperate, and entirely unaware that the very deal they were relying on to save them from a $3,000 country club bill was about to become the evidence that would send them to federal prison. Would you have ignored your mother's weeping texts after she spent her entire life treating you like an outcast? Or would you have given her one last chance to apologize? If your family has ever tried to weaponize your guilt to cover up their own crimes, you will understand why my heart remained as cold as the code that was about to destroy them. As the long, grueling night dragged on, the lights inside the main mansion remained glaringly, frantically bright, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawns. At precisely 11:30, I watched through my security monitor as a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled up the driveway and parked near the grand entrance. Out stepped Richard "Rich" Devlin, a notorious high-priced defense attorney known throughout Atlanta for helping Buckhead's corrupt elite stall the legal system through forged documents, aggressive delay tactics, and malicious media smear campaigns. My parents and Julian had clearly spent their remaining liquid cash to retain Devlin, hoping that his reputation for ruthless, dirty legal tricks would be enough to intimidate me into backing down before the eviction clock ran out. I poured myself another cup of strong, black coffee, watching the headlights of Devlin's car cut through the dark night, knowing that their reliance on a crooked lawyer was nothing more than a desperate gamble that would only speed up their collective downfall. By midnight, the first strike from Devlin's office arrived in my attorney's email inbox in the form of an emergency cease and desist demand and a scanned copy of a fabricated lifetime lease agreement. The document, which Devlin claimed had been signed by me under Aegis Holdings 3 years ago, supposedly granted my parents a non-revocable, lifetime tenancy of the Buckhead mansion for a nominal fee of $1 a year. It was a sloppy, desperate forgery, combining a scanned signature of my name lifted from an old family tax document with a newly typed fraudulent lease agreement. They believed that by producing a conflicting property agreement, they could force Charles Thornton into a lengthy probate and contract dispute, tying up the eviction in court for months while Julian finalized his $39 million buyout. But my family's desperation did not stop with a forged lease. They decided to use physical intimidation to block any attempt to enforce the eviction. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron security gates at the entrance of the estate clanked shut with a cold, metallic ring that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. 2 burly, private security guards in black tactical gear, hired by Devlin's firm using the last of my father's credit line, parked a massive armored SUV directly across the driveway, effectively locking me inside my guest cottage and physically blocking any entrance by the Fulton County Sheriff's Department. My father and Julian believed that by creating a physical barrier and showing a willingness to fight, they would make the sheriff's deputies hesitate to enforce the writ of possession, turning a standard civil eviction into a high-stakes standoff. The ultimate, fatal mistake occurred at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning when my phone buzzed with a direct, written blackmail threat from Julian's personal number. The message was long, cold, and dripping with his signature, unearned arrogance. Clara, we have the signed lifetime lease, and our attorney is currently filing it with the county court. Sign the debt assumption agreement and drop the eviction by 8:30 a.m., or we will release a highly damaging, fabricated video of you stealing corporate data from Henderson and Associates to the FBI and your firm's compliance board. You have 5 hours to save your career, or we will destroy you. He had put the entire extortion scheme in writing, sending it from his personal, GPS-tracked phone, thinking that the threat of public disgrace would finally break my quiet, submissive resolve. I sat at my desk, looking at the glowing screen of my phone, and let out a soft, genuine laugh that dissolved the last lingering shadows of my childhood trauma. I did not reply to his text, nor did I panic. I simply forwarded the entire screenshot, along with the digital metadata of the forged lease agreement, directly to Detective Miller of the Fulton County Police and Charles Thornton. By putting the extortion threat in writing and fabricating a real estate contract to obstruct a pending court eviction, my family had just crossed the line from civil contract fraud into federal wire fraud, witness intimidation, and felony extortion. The longer they talked and the harder they fought, the less my attorney would ever need to explain in a courtroom. I logged into my secure Aegis Holdings security system, zooming in on the hired guards blocking the main gates, watching them sip hot coffee in their warm vehicle, completely unaware of the legal tsunami that was building just a few miles away. Devlin's entire strategy was built on the assumption that I would panic, that my quiet, non-confrontational nature would make me surrender before the 8:30 a.m. deadline. But they had forgotten that I was a forensic accountant. I did not deal in emotional bluffs, fear, or intimidation. I dealt in cold, unyielding facts. And every single fact in our possession was a nail in their collective coffin. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the gray Atlanta fog, the clock ticked down to 7:30, with only 1 hour left on Julian's blackmail ultimatum. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the single $500 bill Julian had thrown at me the night before, and slipped it into my pocket, knowing that I would soon be returning it to him under very different circumstances. The quiet neighborhood of Buckhead was beginning to wake up, entirely unaware of the massive convoy of law enforcement vehicles and bank fraud representatives that was currently gathering just 3 blocks away, waiting for the clock to strike 8. Would you have stayed as calm as I did during the final hours of a family blackmail threat? Or would you have broken under the immense pressure? If you have ever had your own relatives try to destroy your career just to protect their own stolen wealth, you will understand why I felt absolutely no fear as I watched the sheriff's convoy prepare to roll. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Charles Thornton called me to discuss the final execution of the writ of possession. He asked if we should have the Fulton County Sheriff's deputies cut the heavy iron chains at the main gates at 8 o'clock sharp, using the police escort to physically force my parents out in their bathrobes. I looked out my cottage window at the mansion's grand ballroom, where catering trucks were already beginning to park along the side driveway, and I told Charles to hold the line. My mother, Eleanor Vance, was scheduled to host the annual Buckhead Botanical Association Charity Gala in that very ballroom at 8 o'clock tonight. The absolute pinnacle of her high society calendar, with over 150 of Atlanta's wealthiest real estate developers, bank board members, and county commissioners in attendance. I realized that a quiet, early morning eviction would allow my parents to sneak away in the dark, fabricating a story to their friends about why they had sold the estate. I wanted them to feel completely safe, completely victorious, so they would walk straight into the trap they had built for themselves in front of the exact people they had tried to impress. I instructed Charles to send a formal written response to Richard Devlin, stating that we were currently evaluating the validity of the handwritten lifetime lease agreement and would suspend any physical eviction efforts until a formal court hearing could be scheduled. This was a calculated, strategic delay designed to give Robert and Eleanor absolute, false confidence. When Devlin received the message, he would undoubtedly tell my parents that his legal genius had successfully paralyzed my attorney, giving them the green light to proceed with their lavish charity event. I watched through my security monitor as my father and Julian walked out onto the grand portico, laughing and slapping Devlin on the back, completely convinced they had successfully bullied me into submission and secured their golden cage for life. With their false confidence secured, I spent the next 2 hours quietly taking absolute control of the gala's logistics from behind the scenes. Since Aegis Holdings was the legal owner of the estate, I called the event's catering director and the AV technical director, discovering that Robert's credit cards had defaulted on the final $15,000 deposit for the evening's sound and projection equipment. I quietly paid the balance using my corporate trust account, transferring all contracts, security clearances, and AV controls directly into my name, making me the sole legal client of the event. The technical crew was instructed to run a secondary fiber optic cable from my guest cottage directly to the main ballroom's high-definition projector screens, giving me absolute control over the microphones and the visual display at the press of a single key on my laptop. Next, I coordinated the final timing of the law enforcement arrival with Detective Miller and Sarah Jenkins at Vanguard Private Wealth. Sarah had already secured the federal banking fraud and identity theft warrants for Julian's arrest, while Detective Miller had compiled the criminal extortion files based on the blackmail texts Julian had sent me at 3 o'clock that morning. We agreed that the Fulton County Sheriff's deputies, the bank's legal compliance team, and the federal investigators would arrive at the mansion at precisely 9 o'clock tonight, right during the main toast when my mother would be standing on the grand stage, bragging to the Buckhead elite about our family's elite business restructuring. Throughout the afternoon, the estate was a buzzing hive of high society preparation. Florists carried towering arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas through the grand front doors, while caterers in crisp white uniforms set up heavy silver platters and crystal champagne flutes on the marble terraces. My parents and Julian spent the day acting like royalty, walking through the gardens and directing the staff with arrogant authority, completely unaware that every single florist, caterer, and security guard was currently working on an event that I legally owned. I sat in my quiet cottage, listening to the distant, elegant hum of classical music being sound-checked in the ballroom, preparing my digital evidence files and my own elegant black dress for the evening's performance. I knew that during the gala, my mother would take the microphone to publicly thank her friends, drop hints about Julian's $39 million tech acquisition, and likely make a passive-aggressive comment about my unfortunate absence to justify why I had been excluded from the family circle. I let her prepare her speech, letting her rehearse the lies she would tell to the country club elite, knowing that every word she spoke would only make her public collapse more devastating. Her arrogance was doing the cross-examination for me, and the longer she boasted, the less my attorney would ever need to explain to the public. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the first luxury sedans and sports cars began winding up the brick driveway, their headlights reflecting off the wet pine trees of the estate. The heavy iron gates had been opened wide, welcoming the wealthiest families in Atlanta to a grand mansion they believed belonged to the prestigious Vance family. I stood in my cottage, fastening the zipper of a simple but flawless black silk dress, looking at the folders on my desk with a calm, liberating sense of completion. Would you have allowed your toxic family to host a lavish $300,000 party in your own house just to make their public downfall more complete? Or would you have shut it down before the first guest arrived? If you have ever had to watch hypocrites pretend to be royalty while using your money, you will understand why I had to let them have their final, glittering moment under the spotlight. The grand ballroom of the mansion was a sea of glittering diamonds, custom tuxedos, and flowing silk gowns. The air thick with the sweet, heavy scent of expensive white orchids and vintage champagne. Eleanor Vance was in her absolute, glittering element, holding court near a massive, sculpted ice swan at the center of the room, laughing loudly with the wives of federal judges and banking CEOs who had made up her social circle for decades. She looked radiant in her designer emerald gown, completely ignoring the fact that the entire event had been funded by credit cards that were currently defaulting, and that she was standing in a house she no longer legally owned. My father stood beside her, clad in a rented tuxedo that he was proudly claiming was custom-made in London, adjusting his gold cufflinks and basking in the false warmth of their elite peers. They had successfully convinced themselves that Richard Devlin's forged lifetime lease had paralyzed my legal standing, and they were celebrating their victory in the most public, arrogant way possible. A few yards away, Julian was standing with a group of high-profile real estate investors and local venture capitalists, clutching a crystal flute of expensive Dom Perignon. He was discussing VLS, his stolen logistics software, with a loud, confident arrogance, dropping phrases like disruptive technology and algorithmic shipping efficiency, while gesturing with his hands like a true Silicon Valley prodigy. He was boasting about the upcoming $39 million acquisition deal with Vanguard Shipping, promising the investors a double-digit return if they got in on his next shell company venture early. He acted as though he had built the entire digital empire with his own hands, entirely ignoring the fact that he could not write a single line of basic code, and that the very software he was pitching was built from files he had stolen from my old backup hard drive in the library. I quietly slipped into the ballroom through the side garden terrace doors, blending seamlessly into the back of the crowd in my simple black silk dress. I held a glass of sparkling water, observing the room with a calm, analytical eye, watching the hypocrisy and fake wealth play out under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. It took less than 5 minutes for Julian's arrogant gaze to lock onto me from across the crowded room, his eyes narrowing before a smug, victorious smirk spread across his face. He whispered something to his wealthy friends, handed his champagne glass to a passing waiter, and began marching toward the back of the ballroom to confront me, his chest puffed out with unearned confidence. Julian stopped just inches away from me, flanked by two of his wealthy country club friends, his face flushed with champagne and the absolute certainty of his triumph. "Well, well, look who decided to crawl out of her little stone cottage," he sneered, his voice dropping to a low, vicious whisper so the nearby guests wouldn't hear. "You missed the 8:30 a.m. deadline to sign the debt papers, Clara. But we're feeling incredibly generous tonight because of the party. You have until tomorrow morning to sign the agreement, or Devlin will officially file the lifetime lease and have you blacklisted from every accounting firm in the Southeast. You're ruined, Vicky. And tomorrow, you'll be sleeping in a cheap motel." My parents quickly joined the circle. My mother, Eleanor, casting a disgusted, evaluating look at my simple black dress. "What are you doing here, Clara? This event is for the true elite of Buckhead, not for a bitter, ungrateful daughter who tries to sue her own family," she whispered sharply, her voice dripping with class contempt as she adjusted her pearls. My father smirked, adjusting his silk bow tie as he gave me a cold, patronizing look. "You should have signed the papers when you had the chance, Clara. The game is over. Devlin has already secured our lifetime lease, and you have absolutely no power in this house anymore." I looked at my family, letting them speak, letting them dig the hole deeper with every single word of arrogant mockery they uttered in front of their wealthy peers. I did not defend myself. I did not raise my voice. And I did not let them see a single trace of anger or fear on my face. I simply looked at my watch. 8:45 p.m. What they didn't know was that every word of their threats and their confessions of using the forged lifetime lease was being captured by the wireless microphone I had quietly activated on the lapel of a nearby catering captain who was standing just 2 feet away. Julian turned to introduce me to a gentleman standing nearby. Mr. Haylett, Edward Sterling, a senior board member of Vanguard Private Wealth who was attending the gala as a guest of honor. "Mr. Haylett Sterling, this is my sister, Clara," Julian bragged, his voice dripping with condescension as he clapped a hand onto my shoulder. "VLS is about to change global shipping, and Clara here is just a little jealous because she didn't have the vision to build something of this scale. She actually tried to claim she owned the software. Can you believe that?" Mr. Haylett Sterling looked at me, then at Julian, a look of professional curiosity on his face, completely unaware of the legal storm that was currently gathering just outside the ballroom doors. I gave Mr. Sterling a polite, calm smile, refusing to react to Julian's insult, as I took a slow sip of my water. The clock was ticking down to 9 o'clock, and the air inside the grand ballroom was beginning to feel heavy with anticipation. Have you ever had to stand silent while arrogant people bragged about stealing your work in front of a crowded room of their peers? If you have ever had to protect your peace and wait for the perfect moment to strike, you will understand why I kept my eyes fixed on the entrance doors as the clock began to strike 9. At exactly 9 o'clock, the crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed, and a single, bright spotlight focused on the center of the stage. My mother, Eleanor Vance, walked up the stairs with a triumphant smile, clutching a silver wireless microphone, her emerald gown catching the light as she prepared to address the crowd of Buckhead's most influential citizens. She began her speech by thanking her elite friends for their charity donations, but within 2 minutes, she pivoted to her true agenda, gesturing proudly toward Julian, who was standing near the front of the stage. "As many of you know, our family is embarking on a brilliant new corporate chapter tonight," Eleanor announced, her voice echoing through the high-end sound system. My son Julian's logistics system is currently being acquired by Vanguard Shipping in a historic $39 million deal, proving that the Vance family legacy of success is stronger than ever. But the applause she expected was suddenly cut short by a sharp, high-pitched screech of microphone feedback that made the guests wince. The massive multimedia projector screens behind Eleanor, which were supposed to display a slideshow of the Buckhead Botanical Gardens, suddenly flickered and went entirely black, replaced by a glowing Aegis Holdings secure loading screen. My mother frowned, tapping the microphone and calling out to the AV crew in the back with an embarrassed laugh. "Excuse us, everyone. It seems we have a minor technical glitch with our presentation," she said, trying to maintain her high society composure, completely unaware that the technical crew was currently lockstepped with my laptop in the guest cottage. I walked slowly and deliberately out from the shadows of the ballroom, stepping up the grand marble staircase onto the stage, directly into the bright, white light of the spotlight. Eleanor's face twisted into a look of pure, unadulterated horror as she saw me, her knuckles turning white as she clutched the microphone. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed into the mic. "Security! Remove this woman immediately! She is an unstable, trespassing intruder who is trying to disrupt our charity event!" But the private security guards standing at the perimeter of the stage did not move a single inch. They stood perfectly still, their arms crossed, their loyalty already secured by the $15,000 event deposits I had paid that afternoon. The AV technical director handed me a fully active wireless microphone, and I stood at the center of the stage, looking out at the crowd of 150 wealthy guests whose champagne glasses were frozen midair. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with absolute forensic clarity through the ballroom, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "My name is Clara Vance, and I am the sole founder, managing director, and owner of Aegis Holdings, LLC, the company that legally purchased this estate 3 years ago. The people hosting this gala tonight are not the owners of this mansion. They are delinquent tenants who have failed to pay their occupancy fees for 7 months, and they have been formally served with a 48-hour eviction notice that expires tonight." With a single tap on my tablet, the massive projector screens behind me flashed with the certified, county-recorded property deed of the Buckhead Mansion, displaying the Aegis Holdings corporate seal and listing Robert and Eleanor Vance as delinquent occupants. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd of Buckhead socialites as they stared at the official public records, their eyes shifting from the screen to my parents, who were standing on stage, frozen like statues in the harsh spotlight. My father's face turned a deep, furious shade of red, while my mother looked as if she were about to faint, her silver microphone slipping from her hand and hitting the stage floor with a loud, hollow thud. I didn't stop with the deed. I swiped my tablet again, displaying the federal patent filings and the source code repository for the Aegis 6 logistics platform. Furthermore, the software my brother Julian is attempting to sell to Vanguard Shipping for $39 million is my proprietary, patented technology, I announced, pointing to the glowing cryptographic signatures on the screen. He copied a fragment of my source code from my backup hard drive and renamed it VLS. But every single line of that code contains my unique, registered watermark. He has committed federal bank fraud, identity theft, and loan forgery to fund his fake, wealthy lifestyle, and his prospective investors are currently looking at a stolen asset. Mr. Edward Sterling, the senior board member of Vanguard Private Wealth, stood up from his front row table, his face dark with professional fury as he stared at the patent records displaying my name as the sole creator and Vanguard's own active licensing contract. He turned his gaze to Julian, who was standing at the edge of the stage, a cold, terrified sweat breaking out on his forehead as he realized his entire $39 million buyout had just vaporized in front of the very financial elites he had spent years trying to impress. Julian looked at the screen, then at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, wild panic as the reality of his criminal exposure finally crashed down around him. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the single $500 bill Julian had thrown at me when he demanded my surrender, and let it flutter slowly to the stage floor at his feet. "You told me to take this and sign the papers, Julian," I said, my voice carrying over the silent, stunned crowd. "But I don't need your $500, because I already own the very room you are standing in." Would you have had the courage to stand on a grand stage in front of 150 wealthy socialites and expose your own family's fraud? Or would you have handled it privately? If you have ever had your work and your name stolen by the people who claimed to protect you, you will understand why I had to let the room go dead silent before the heavy oak doors of the ballroom finally clicked open. The heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding metallic click, and the collective whisper of the crowd died instantly. Detective Miller, accompanied by 4 uniformed Fulton County Sheriff's deputies and 2 federal financial crimes investigators, marched down the center aisle of the ballroom, their boots echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. The clinking of handcuffs on their utility belts was the only sound in the suffocatingly quiet room as they walked straight toward the grand stage. The guests watched in absolute stunned silence, many of them pulling out their phones to record the historic, humiliating collapse of Buckhead's most prestigious family. My father stood paralyzed, his rented tuxedo suddenly looking cheap and oversized under the harsh spotlight, while Julian took a frantic step backward, his eyes darting toward the side terrace doors, only to find 2 more deputies blocking his path. Detective Miller stepped up onto the stage, pulling a set of federal arrest warrants from his breast pocket and looking directly at my brother. "Julian Vance, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, and felony extortion," Miller announced, his voice carrying clearly over the silent, shocked crowd. Before Julian could even speak, a deputy grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back and clicking the steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The crowd gasped as the golden boy of the Vance family was forced to bow his head, his expensive champagne flute shattering on the stage floor, mixing with the spilled Dom Perignon and the crumpled $500 bill I had dropped at his feet. The instant the metal cuffs clicked around Julian's wrists, the fragile veneer of family loyalty completely shattered, and they turned on each other with a vicious, desperate fury. My father, Robert, panicked and began shouting at Julian, his face twisting into a mask of pure, selfish terror as he tried to save his own skin. "You told me she signed it, Julian. You told me Clara authorized the credit line," Robert screamed, trying to pull away from a deputy who was currently arresting him as an accessory to fraud. "You ruined us. You dragged me into your pathetic, fraudulent schemes." My mother, Eleanor, wept hysterically, grabbing the deputy's sleeve and begging him to use his influence, but her cries were entirely ignored as my father was handcuffed and escorted down the stage stairs beside his golden son. Richard Devlin, their high-priced defense attorney, immediately packed his leather briefcase, refusing to look at my parents as he tried to slip out of the ballroom through the side exit. But Charles Thornton stepped into his path, handing him a formal state bar disciplinary filing for presenting a forged lease agreement to a county court, warning him that his license to practice law in Georgia was as good as dead. Devlin didn't say a word. He simply snatched the papers, turned his head in shame, and rushed out into the cold night, leaving my parents completely defenseless in front of the very socialites they had lied to for years. A senior sheriff's deputy turned to Eleanor, informing her that the 48-hour eviction notice had officially expired, and she had exactly 2 hours to pack a single suitcase of clothes and vacate the property immediately. Julian looked at me from the center of the stage, tears streaming down his face as he fell to his knees, his hands cuffed behind his back, begging for my mercy. "Clara, please, we are blood. Blood is thicker than water," he sobbed, his voice cracking with a desperate, wild panic. "We will sign whatever you want. We will leave the house. Just please tell the police to drop the charges. Don't do this to your own family." I looked down at him with an absolute, calm detachment, feeling neither anger nor pity, but a profound, liberating peace. "Blood made us related, Julian, but respect makes a family," I said quietly, my voice carrying over the silent room. "I did not lock you in this cell. You built it yourself, line by line, forgery by forgery. I only stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices." By midnight, the grand mansion was completely, beautifully silent. The wealthy guests had fled, the catering trucks had packed up their silver platters, and my parents had been physically escorted from the property by the sheriff's deputies, carrying only 2 mismatched suitcases of clothes to a cheap roadside motel. I walked through the empty, darkened ballroom, the crystal chandeliers cast in shadow, feeling the heavy, suffocating burden of my past finally dissolving into the quiet night. I walked down the stone path to my cottage, sat at my desk, and looked at my laptop screen, where the secure bank portal showed that the $39 million wire transfer from the tech acquisition had officially cleared, safely shielded inside my secure asset protection trust. My family had spent my entire life trying to hide me in the shadows, calling me a failure, and using my quiet nature as a license to exploit my hard work. But in the end, the very silence they mistook for surrender was the weapon that dismantled their entire empire, leaving them with nothing but the consequences of their own greed. I did not lose a family tonight. I escaped a debt I never owed, walking out of their gilded cage and into a brilliant, peaceful future that I had built with my own hands. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If you have ever had to let go of toxic relatives to protect your own peace and your own success, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below. Because the sweetest revenge is not destruction. It is the absolute freedom of living your best life. I'm now.